All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Baruch Hashem, first of all, a tremendous thank you to Rabbi Richter, to Rabbi Josh Erez, for the chevra that gave the shir while I was away. It's Baruch Hashem, a great zechus to be back with everyone. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this. Oh, thank you. All of our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves, Habar Linu Latov, Ushi and Mindy Schreiber. In the schos of a refuah shlema for Eliyahu Rafal ben Miriam and Mati and Chanalea Margalit, in memory of Mati's father Yosef Shlomo Moshe Shmuel ben Yikosi Yehuda, whose yard site is on Chaf Dalid Teves. And our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Alan and Sue Meyrowitz, in memory of Sue's mother Mindel Bas Shlomo Todrich Zichrono Levrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need a refuah shavin together, Kol Cholei Yisrael. Halav Baruch Hu should continue to send besoros tovos to all of Am Yisrael. Also, it's important to recognize this. Start out by also wishing everyone a happy New Year. You know, a lot of times when we come to the secular New Year, we as Jews are a little bit not sure exactly what to do with this. On one hand, obviously, I'm not wishing anyone Ksiv Chasim Tova, you know, but at the same time, again, obviously, it would be ridiculous to think we live in this world, right? I would venture to say none of us are dating our checks, you know, in accordance with what day of Teves it is, you know, and again, in general, Karasanza, so we're living with the secular date. So there's a beautiful idea, in general, brought down in the Surah about this concept that there's a power to the secular New Year. Why? Because in general, whenever in this world you find a koach of hischadshus, you find a koach of renewal, you should always ride that wave. And the truth is, when the New Year comes, there is a feeling of newness. There is a feeling of no, right? You see people always making their New Year's resolutions, right? People always trying to tap into this idea that a new year, like Mishana Shana, Mishana Mazel. It's a new year, and when the new year comes, it tells me like whatever was. My Dahava Hava, 2025 was 2025, and now 2026 represents really a whole parsha, a whole year, a whole chapter that has not yet been written. See, even though it might not be the primary marking of time that we follow as Jews, and even though, again, for us, obviously, it's not our Rosh Hashanah, right? Our Rosh Hashanah is Tishrei, but at the end of the day, there is something exciting when there's a newness in the world. And it behooves us to tap into it. It behooves us to try to figure out what in our own lives do we want to renew? What in our own lives do we want to be mechadesh? What in our own lives do we kind of want to shake off a little bit of the lethargy and a little bit of just like the general kind of, you know, I think we go through life a lot and we feel like what's the expression? Like the mouse on the wheel? It's not the expression. Hamster on the wheel, right? The hamster on the wheel, and like it's kind of like lahavdil. I don't know. They might have, you know, like a shtickle like Groundhog Day. To those of you who get that reference, right? You know, so like kind of just like the over and over and over and over again, and it becomes a little bit depressing because we wonder to ourselves, like, how am I ever going to break this cycle? And the truth is, today represents an opportunity. It's a new day. It's New Year, it's January 1st, 2026. The world, the universe has never seen a January 1st, 2026. This is the first date like this ever. And because there is such a newness that is in here, ultimately, again, we have the power, if we want to tap into it as well. Just because it's not our, so to speak, Jewish New Year, doesn't mean that we as residents and as members of humanity cannot tap into the wave of newness that is here. And we'll say, and to kind of compound that, just to think about this, we have a new Mishnah. We have a new Mishnah in Maseches Zevachim. What are the chances that on the new year, a new Mishnah, and by the way, I will say, all kidding aside, a new Mishnah on the very top of Amud Aleph. Right? That's unique. That's unique. Not like a new Mishnah in the middle of the page. New Mishnah, top of Amud Aleph. And I will say, this is HaKadosh Baruch Hu giving us another one of these kisses. If you want to be someone different, right? Because a lot of us have midos that are not good, but we've been living with them for years. I could change it. A lot of us have behaviors that are less than optimal, holding me back. I can change it. A lot of us have many elements of our lives that just are mediocre at best. And if I want, I could change it. January 1st, 2026 is a new year. Maseches Zevachim Daf Kuf Tes 109 has a Mishnah on top, a new Hischadshus. And I must say, certainly for us for Daf Yomi, Zevachim has not been an easy run. It's been fantastic. I think it's best Masechta ever, but it has not been. I've heard some rumblings and grumblings, bordering on complaints, a shtickle happy curses even, right? But and again, I'll say, you know what? Get it together. Get it together. We're nearing the end of Maseches Zevachim. Get it together. Time for big boy pants. Time for us to get this. Let's finish the Masechta strong. If you want to be whiny and distracted, you can be whiny and distracted. But if you want to say January 1st, 2026, Hischadshus, I got this. Okay, maybe not the first 108 blot of Maseches Zevachim, but you know what? 109 to the end, I'm going to own this, right? 109 to the end, I got this. You know what I'm saying? Everything in life is about your perspective, and everything in life is about desire, identifying and having a vision for the person you want to be. New Mishnah, new year, untold possibilities. Let's jump in together. Mishnah top of Kuf Tes and Medalef 109a. Echad kachim ksherim, ve'echad kachim psulin. So we are continuing on the topic, which has been the topic of this particular parak, which is that what happens with shkutei chutz? What happens when you go and you offer up certain things outside of the confines of the Beis HaMikdash? So now the Mishnah says, Echad kachim ksherim, whether you're talking about, again, karbanos that are kosher, the echad kachim psulin, or we're going to go ahead and talking about invalid karbanos, shahaya pisulin bakodesh. I will say, if you remember again, this actually brings us back a little bit. You remember we had the sugya, I don't even remember when this was, but we had the sugya about what happens if you put an invalid carbon on the mizbeach. Do you take it down or not? So if you remember again, the Gemara, actually, the Mishnah made a distinction between a carbon that becomes invalidated inside of the mikdash versus a carbon that became invalidated outside of the mikdash. So again, the carbon that became invalidated inside of the mikdash, if you put it on the mizbeach, you don't take it off. But a carbon that was invalidated outside of the Beis Mikdash, which essentially means it was invalidated from the beginning, if you inadvertently put it on the Mizbeach, you take it off. So look at the Mishnah saying, Echad kachim ksherim, so whether you're talking about carbonos which are kosher, ve'echad kachim psulim, or you're talking about the carbon that apostle, shahaya pisulim bakodesh, but the psul, the invalidation developed inside of the Beis HaMikdash itself, v'krivan bachutz, and then you went ahead and unfortunately, you offered up this carbon outside of the Beis HaMikdash, chayiv. You are chayiv. And I will say, now the idea over here is, what the Mishnah is highlighting to us is, in order to be chayiv for offering up a carbon outside of the Beis HaMikdash, it has to be the kind of carbon which could have been on the Mizbeach, right? So therefore there are two categories, either a kosher carbon or a carbon, ultimately, again, whose invalidation developed inside of the mikdash. Because even such a carbon, although ideally you would not have put that on the Mizbeach, if you did put it on the Mizbeach, you would not put it down. Only a carbon that reaches this heightened level of what we'll call kashrus, if you offered it up outside of the Beis HaMikdash, there is liability. Good. Furthermore, if a person offers up a kezayis of an olah and the imurin. Now, both say, now remember again, an olah is a carbon that is totally consumed in the mizbeach. Imurin refers to the specific sacrificial parts. So Rashi understands over here that what this is talking about is as follows. If you offered up a half a kezayis of an olah and a half a kezayis of its sacrificial parts. So in other words, you have an entire kezayis, but half of it is the olah meat, and half of it is the sacrificial parts, and you offer that up outside of the Beis HaMikdash, you are chayiv. So there's two halachas that's being taught over here. Number one, you're only chayiv for offering up a kezayis of carbonic material outside of the Beis HaMikdash. And the novelty that the Mishnah is introducing is if that kezayis is made up of two different carbonic materials, in this case, olah meat and olah sacrificial parts, ultimately, again, they combine to create liability. Good. Both say, let's analyze. Turn Rabbanon. Asher ya'ala ola o zevach. Ainli ela ola. Minayin l'rabbo say murei asham ve'murei chatos. Both say, now listen to this. So the Gemara says as follows. When speaking about the halacha of shkutei chutz, of offering up karbanos outside of the Beis HaMikdash, it's interesting to note how the pasuk is phrased, right? The Torah says, "Va'aleim tomar ish mi beis Yisrael min hager asher yagur b'socham asher ya'ala ola o zavach." So it's interesting, and then the next pasuk is Val Pesach o Moed lo yavienu lasos v'nichras hanefesh me'amav. If you offer up karbanos outside of the Beis HaMikdash, the penalty is kares. The Gemara is pointing out it's interesting to note that the carbon that is mentioned in the pasuk that you're not allowed to offer up outside of the Beis Hamikdash is an ola. That's ola. So therefore, the Gemara asks a very simple question. So the Gemara says, "Tzara baran asher ya'ale ola o zavach eimli ela ola." Minayin l'rabos imure asham. How do I know? So I only know that you can't offer up an ola outside of the Beis Hamikdash. How do I know that you can't offer up? Now the Gemara is going to go through a whole list. Imure asham, the sacrificial parts of an asham. Ve'imure chatos, sacrificial parts of a chatos. Ve'imure kodshei kadashim, or the sacrificial parts of kodshei kadashim. Ve'imure kodshim kalim, or the sacrificial parts of kodshim kalim. How do I know that there is liability for offering all these items up outside of the Beis Hamikdash as well? Talmud lomar zavach. Therefore, the pasuk says zavach. Zavach, I will say ultimately, or zevach, I should say zevach. Zevach is a word that means carbon. Carbon. And therefore, again, it comes to include all of these other sacrificial items as well. Minayin l'rabos, minayin l'rabos hakometz, v'halavona, v'aktoris. We'll say, so now we transition into non-typical carbonic items, really things that don't really have like zrika, like blood associated with them. So how do I know to include kometz, which I will say, remember again, is the 3-fingerful amount of the carbon mincha, levona, frankincense, kitoras, the kitoras, actually Rashi points out, well, let's go back to kitoras, right? Minchas kohanim, so the mincha of kohanim, or minchas kohen Mashiach. Shabbos, I remember again, this is the specific mincha that's brought by the Kohen Gadol every single day. V'hamenasech shloshes lugin yayin, or a libation made up of 3 lugin of wine, o shloshes lugin mayim, or the 3 lugin of water. We'll say that's for Nisa Chamayim, that's on Sukkis. How do I know that again, if you did any of these items outside of the Beis Hamikdash, that you are liable as well? Talmud lomar, vel pesach oel moed lo yivienu. The pasuk says, when is there liability? If you did not bring it to the entranceway of oel moed. Meaning what? Kol haba lepesach oel moed chayovin alav b'chutz. Anything that is supposed to be brought to Pesach oel moed, anything that is supposed to be brought to the entranceway of the Beis Hamikdash, i.e., anything that's supposed to be brought in the Beis Hamikdash, and you do it outside, ultimately, again, there's liability. So we'll say this is a very, very, very important sugya, because remember again, what the psukim indicate to me is if you brought an ola outside. And remember again, also when we speak about bringing, as you saw in the previous Mishnah, or 2 previous Mishnahs ago, there's 2 levels of liability. There's liability for shechita outside, and there's liability for halah, for offering, for sacrificing, for burning outside. So remember again, the Gemara talks about it. So listen to what we just learned over here. The Gemara tells you the psukim, the concept of not being able to bring a carbon outside of the Beis Hamikdash, that's an explicit pasuk in the Torah. The problem we have is the carbon that the Torah explicitly mentions is ola. So I know I can't bring an ola outside of the Beis Hamikdash. How do I know that I can't bring other karbanos outside of the Beis Hamikdash? Oh, there's another word, zevach. Zevach means an offering. What does offering include? Offering includes anything else under the umbrella of karbanos. But what about the other items that are kodshim but not karbanos? Kitoras, levona, mincha, all these things. That comes from al pesach oel moi lo avienu. That ultimately, again, I will say that it tells me anything that is supposed to be brought Pesach or Moed in the Beis Hamikdash, and you didn't bring it inside, but you brought it outside, there's liability for it. So the entire sugi of Shchutei Chutz, just right over here. Incredible. The Gemara says, V'en le'ela kodshim kshirim. So I only know, by the way, that this only applies to karbanos that are kosher. Not the rabbos psulin. How do I know ultimately, again, that this invalid, that this applies even to puzzle karbanos? I will say this is very interesting. Keep going. For example, halon v'hayotze v'hatame. So we'll say, for example, let's say I have a carbon that was shechted inside of the Beis Hamikdash, and lun means it was left overnight. It was left overnight. Now that's a disqualification. How do I know that even if I burn that carbon outside of the Beis Hamikdash, there is still liability? Or yotze. Yotze means a carbon that was taken outside of its permitted boundaries. Or v'hatame, or a carbon that became tamei, and again, it became tamei, let's say, inside of the Beis Hamikdash, and you burn it outside. Or shenishchat chutz lizmano v'chutz limkomo, or pigel. How do I know that even a carbon that you had intention, when, let's say, doing the avoda, you had intention to eat it outside of the permitted time, or outside of the permitted place, that even that type of carbon, which is invalid, still there's liability if you burn it outside of the Beis HaMikdash, or v'shekiblo psulin, or for that matter, again, let's say the avoda was done by someone who is pasul, Bizarko es damo, and they went ahead and they did zrika, or v'hanitan lamata shenaslan lamala, or we'll say, for example, let's say at a sacrifice where the blood application was supposed to be done below the red line, but it was done above the red line, or v'hanitan lamala shenaslan lamata, or it was supposed to be done above the red line and it was done below the red line, or v'hanitan b'chutz shenaslan b'fnim, or the blood application was supposed to be done outside of the kodesh, but instead it was done inside, or vice versa. Or it was supposed to be done inside, but it was done outside. Or for that matter, again, the blood applications of a Pesach or a Chatas that were done Shalosh Shman Abosai. This whole list represents karbanos that are invalid. So now, again, how do I know that even when you have, so we'll say all of these are cases where the carbon is being done inside of the Beis HaMikdash, but something happened, one of these things happened, and as a result, the carbon is invalid. How do I know that there is still a prohibition to burn this carbon outside of the Beis HaMikdash? How do I know that? So the Gemara says, Talmud Lomar, lo yivienu lasos. Oh, because the pasuk says, ultimately, again, you did not bring it to the Beis HaMikdash to perform it. Kol hamiskabel bepesach o hamoed chayav alav b'chutz. Whatever is supposed to be done inside of the Beis HaMikdash, and you do it outside, there is liability. So we'll say, so this is incredible. So now, this, by the way, is probably one of the most important Gemaras that we've had in the last little bit, because this is a solid chunk of halacha l'maisa. So what I just learned over here is, number one, that the prohibition of burning a carbon, or either burning or shechting carbon, let's say burning a carbon outside of the Beis HaMikdash, applies to any carbon. Not only does it not apply to carbonos, but it applies to what? It also applies to halacha l'maisa, again, even we'll call it non-animal sacrifices, right? It applies to all types of kachim, all types of sacrificial items. Number three, it even applies to invalid karbanos. So if you have a carbon that was invalidated for some reason, whatever, like we just saw all the lists of reasons, right? There's no shortage of reasons for karbanos to become invalidated. Even so, you still can't burn that. If you take that carbon outside of the Beis HaMikdash and you burn it, you are in violation. You're in violation. So it applies to all animal offerings, all non-animal offerings, and even to invalidated karbanos cannot be burned outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Incredible. We'll say a solid chunk of invigorating. Incredible. Let's go back there. Hamalek zayis min ha'olah. So next we'll say, remember again, how did the Mishnah end? So it's actually very interesting. So the Mishnah said that if you burnt a half a kizayis of ola and a murin, which means that if you went ahead and you burnt a half a kizayis, ultimately again of ola meat, right? Of ola meat and sacrificial parts of ola. Now again, this might sound a little bit confusing because ola obviously is fully burnt on the mizbeach. But even an ola has a murin, which are the specific sacrificial parts that are burnt separate and distinct from the rest of the carbon. So what the Mishnah told me was, right, there's only liability if you offer up a kizayis of sacrificial matter outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So if you have a half a kizayis of ola meat and a half a kizayis of ola sacrificial parts, those two kizayisim combine to form the requisite unit for liability. Okay, so the Gemara says, fine. The Gemara says, but it's interesting. Ola ve'emureha in, shlama ve'emurehen lo. So it sounds like this is dafka din by ola, and let's say not a din by shlamim. Right, so let's say by shlamim, in other words, the fact that the Mishnah illustrated this example with an ola makes it sound like this is unique to ola. But for example, if you were to take a half a kizayis of shlamim meat, and a half a kizayis of shlamim sacrificial parts, and combine them together, that would not combine to form the requisite shear. That's what it sounds like. To which the Gemara says, Tanina laha de Tanrabanan. So we'll say, indeed, we learned this. Listen to this. The Gemara says, Tanrabanan, ola ve'emureha mitztarfen lekizayis la losan b'chutz. So we'll say, so listen to this. So this price actually is a bit more expansive. An ola, meaning ola meat, and the sacrificial parts of ola, combine to form the requisite shear of a kizayis, which again means if you take a half a kizayis of ola meat and a half a kizayis of ola sacrificial parts and you combine them together, they form a kizayis. What are the ramifications of that? La losan b'chutz. So, for example, if you offered up that combined amount outside of the base of Mikdash, there would be liability. Furthermore, ulechayiv alei mishum pigol nosar v'tamei. Furthermore, that combined amount ultimately, again, could also make you liable because of pigol, nosar, and tumah. Okay, so let's dissect that statement. So bishlama ha'alas ola dekalil in shlamim lo. So I understand ultimately again why in terms of let's say offering it up outside of the base of Mikdash. So I understand why a half a kizayis of ola meat and a half a kizayis of all the sacrificial parts combined. Why? Because they all have the same, the same, destiny is the wrong word, but they all have the same status in that what? They're all fully consumed on the Mizbeach, right? Because all the meat, the truth is treated no differently than all the sacrificial parts. All the sacrificial parts are burned on the Mizbeach, and all the meat is burned on the sacrifice. So that makes sense, therefore, when it comes to, let's say, burning them outside of the Beis HaMikdash, that half a kizayis of all the meat and half a kizayis of all the sacrificial parts could combine together to form the kizayis. The Gemara says, about shlamim lo. But it makes sense to say that, let's say, a half a kizayis of shlamim meat and a half a kizayis of shlamim sacrificial parts don't combine, right? Why? Why wouldn't they combine? Because we'll say, what happens to shlamim meat? What happens to shlamim meat? You eat it, right? And what happens to shlamim sacrificial parts? They're burnt on the mizbeach. So I understand why those two can't combine. However, ela pigol v'nosar v'tamei my taima. I don't understand, but why? When it comes to so Mar is making a distinction. When it comes to, let's say again, half a kizayis of sacrificial matter, right, sacrificial meat and sacrificial parts combining, I understand why they combine in the case of ola, not in the case of shlamim, because in the case of ola, the meat is treated the same thing as a sacrifice. Everything is burnt to the mizbeach. When it comes to shlamim, however, meat is consumed, sacrificial parts, I understand why they can't combine. But in other areas of halacha, ela pigol nosar v'tamei my taima. But when it comes to pigol, nosar, and tamei, why would shlamim be treated any differently than ola? In other words, if you're going to tell me that by ola, a half a kizayis of meat and a half a kizayis of sacrificial parts combined for pigol, nosar, and tamei, then why in the world would shlamim be treated any differently? So it's actually quite interesting. To which the Gemara says, V'hatinan, we learned, kala pigulin mitzdarfin, v'chala nosar mitzdarfin. So again, first of all, the Mishnah explicitly says it, that when it comes to pigul, all parts of the carbon combine, and when it comes to nosar, all parts of the carbon combine. So I said, just understand, right? In other words, you're only chayiv for pigul. Remember again, we'll say, what's pigul? Little chazar, what's pigul? Pigul, right? Pigul is a mindset, right? Pigul is when I'm doing some type of one of the avodas of the carbon I have in mind to eat it outside of the permitted time. So for example, when it comes to pigul, if you have in mind to eat a half a kizayis of meat and a half a kizayis of sacrificial parts, which you're not allowed to do anyway, right? But if you have that in mind, they combine. Same thing with nosar. If you leave over from the carbon, ultimately, again, half a kizayis of meat and half a kizayis of sacrificial parts, the Mishnah says explicitly, those combine. Those combine. So kasha pigul pigul, kasha nosar nosar. It's a contradiction. Because the Gemara just said before that when it comes to even pigul, nosar, and tumah, or half a kizayis of meat and sacrificial parts only combined by ola, not by shlamim. The Mishnah says that when it comes to pigul, nosar, and tamei, sacrificial matter always combines. So it's a kasha, it's a contradiction. To which it's actually quite interesting. The Gemara says, pigul lo kasha. It's not a contradiction. How to listen to this? Kan bepigul, kan b'machshavas pigul. So it's actually very interesting. The Gemara says some about two different cases. One is talking about pigul itself, in other words, actual sacrificial pigul matter, and one is talking about the machshava, the intent for pigul. Look at Rashi just a moment. I'll say this is Rashi on the first wide line, not the bottom wide lines, but the first intermediate wide lines there. Kan bepigul, kan machshava. Listen to this. Hadik tani mitztarfin ba'ochel pigul kamar this chayiv chatas. So say when do we say that sacrificial meat and sacrificial parts combine? Right? When do we say they combine? And again, it doesn't matter, ola, shlamim, when do we say they combine? That's when it comes to actual consumption of pigul. If you're consuming pigul, right, you're actually consuming pigul, so whether you're consuming half a kizayis of sacrificial meat and sacrificial parts, it doesn't make a difference. They all combine to form a kizayis, so it's chayiv chatos. V'hadik tani ola in shlamim lo. And when do we say that it only combines by an ola, doesn't combine by a shlamim? When is that? The machshavas pigel. Listen to this. That's when we're talking about the intent of pigel. Shem shachat ozarak amanas lahaktir chati zayis baser ola v'chati zayis meimurin chotz lizmano pigel. Aval b'shlamim chishev le'echol ola haktir chati zayis baser v'chati zayis emurin lo pigel shemach shavas achila beniktar. Okay, so we'll say to get a bit technical for just a moment, but actually still quite interesting. So listen to this. The Gemara says when it comes to pigel consumption, right? If you're actually eating pigel, then again, it doesn't matter what part of the carbon you're consuming. All the parts combine to form a kizai. So again, if you have a whole mass, right, a whole table of pigel carbonic material, right, and part of it is sacrificial meat, part of it is sacrificial parts, right, and you eat a combined kizayis, you're liable. Doesn't matter, shlamim, ola, makes no difference. When is there a distinction of type of the carbon? Listen to this. Well, let's say you're the Kohen and you're having a machshavas pigel. So remember again, let's say the Kohen is doing Kabbalah. He's doing Kabbalah. He's doing Zrika. He's doing Zrika, right? And he has in mind that he's going to consume this carbon outside of the permitted time. That's pigel. So we'll say, now watch this. The Gemara now wants to suggest it makes a difference if it's a shlamim or an ola. How so? If it's an ola and he has in mind that I'm going to eat half a kizayis of meat and half a kizayis of sacrificial parts in 2 days from now, that works, meaning that works and that it's pigel. Why? Because by an ola, the meat and the sacrificial parts are treated the same way. Everything is burned. So therefore, again, that will combine. By a shlamim, if he has in mind that I'm going to eat half a kizayis of meat in 2 days from now and half a kizayis of sacrificial parts in 2 days from now, that machshava does not combine. Why doesn't it combine? Because by a shlamim, the meat and sacrificial parts are treated differently, right? The meat is consumed, the sacrificial parts ultimately again are part of the mizbeach. So interestingly enough, so for consumption of pigel, everything combines. For machshavas pigel, ultimately again by ola, meat and sacrificial parts will combine. By shlamim, meat and sacrificial parts will not combine. Fascinating. So the Gemara says, Nosar lokasha. Similarly, again, it's not a contradiction by nosar. Kan benosar, kan b'shini sosru achel nizrak adam. So Rabbi says it's also very interesting, a bit more technical for just a moment. Right? Furthermore, again, the nosar is also not a question, also not a contradiction. One is talking about an actual, well, let's see Rashi. Look at Rashi. Rashi's in the wide lines, 5 lines in. Kan benosar, kan b'shini sosru achel nizrak adam. Listen to this. Hadiktani mitzdarfin. When do we say that ultimately, again, all forms of nosar combine? That's ba'ochel nosar kamer. That's when it's talking about actual consumption of nosar. You have nosar meat in front of you, whether it's nosar of sacrificial meat, nosar of sacrificial parts, everything combines. And when do we say ultimately, and when do we say that nosar only applies to ola, not to shlamim? Listen to Rabbi say. A very specific case. What happens, let's say, when the sacrificial meat was destroyed before Zrika? Oh, listen to this. Now, we'll say, okay, it's actually very exciting. In order for Zrika to be valid, there has to be at least a kizayis of sacrificial matter left over. In other words, let's say you had a case where you shechted a carbon, you did everything, but before Zrika was done, I don't know, the carbon was accidentally incinerated, right? Somebody wasn't paying attention on the job, they put it on the mizbeach, right? Or it was accidentally thrown out, right? So accidentally destroyed. If there's no sacrificial matter left at the time of Zrika, the carbon is invalid. You need at least the kizayis of the carbon actually left over, actually in existence at the time of the Zrika. So watch this. What happens if halacha l'maisa, you have a half a kizayis of sacrificial meat and a half a kizayis of sacrificial parts? Do they combine to form the requisite kizayis, ultimately again necessary in order to allow for Zrika? And what's the answer? It depends. What does it depend on? It depends on the type of carbon. If it's ola, that indeed the sacrificial meat and the sacrificial parts will combine, because again, they have the same din, they're both part of the Mizbeach. If it's shlomim, ultimately again, half a kizayis of meat and half a kizayis sacrificial parts will not combine so as to allow zrika. Okay, quite fascinating. Let's go ahead. Mani Rabbi Yeshua, and whose opinion is this? Right, this is Rabbi Yeshua. The sign of Rabbi Yeshua Omer, Kol Zevachim Shebatorah, Shenishtaim Hen behind Kizayis Basar. So let's listen to this. This is actually really fascinating. So ultimately, again, the Gemara says, so this is Rabbi Yeshua. Both say, by the way, this is from Menachos Tesam Aleph. Coming attractions, right? So when you get to Menachos Tesam, you'll be like, oh, I saw that already. And Zevachim Kuftes, very exciting. So the Gemara says as follows. Let's say, yeah, okay. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yeshua says, Kol Zevachim Shebatorah. Any carbon you have. So again, I both say this is going in halacha that I shechted a carbon shechted a carbon, right? And now something happened to the carbon; it got accidentally destroyed. As long as there is a kizayis basar, right? A kizayis, basar, amid beis, ukizayis chelev. It's really o kizayis chelev, right? Or a kizayis of chelev, zorik es adam. So essentially, Rabbi Yeshua says like this. So the Rabbi Yeshua says, as long as there is a kizayis of carbonic material left at the time of the zrika, you can go ahead and do the zrika. Now, interestingly enough, it could be a kizayis of sacrificial meat or a kizayis of chaylev. Remember again, what do you do with chaylev? You burn it on the mizbeach. So essentially, as long as you have a kizayis of sacrificial matter, you're good. Chatzi zayis basar. I'm now 109b for end of the first line. But chatzi zayis basar, the chatzi zayis chelev. But what if you only have a half a kizayis of meat and a half a kizayis chesvos? You see what's happening in this case? In the first iteration, Rabbi Yeshua said, if you have either a kizayis of meat or a kizayis of chelev, you could move forward with the zrika. What happens if you only have a chatzi zayis of basar or a chatzi zayis of chelev? Eino zorik es hadam. So right, you can't go ahead. You can't offer up the carbon, right? However, listen to this. Ubaola chatzi zayis basar v'chatzi zayis chelev zorik es hadam mipnei shekula kalim. Oh, Rabbi say here it is. Watch this. So again, halacha. Rabbi say this is a very important halacha. So remember again, in order to go ahead and do zrika, there has to be at least a kizayis of carbonic material that is in existence at the time of the zrika. Rabbi Yeshua says it's either a kizayis of basar or a kizayis of chelev. Now, what happens if I only have a half a kizayis of basar and a half a kizayis of chelev? Can those two combine? Because we say chelev is an example of a mur, of like sacrificial matter that's burnt on the mizbeach. So what if I only have a half a kizayis of meat and a half a kizayis of chelev? Can those two combine to form the requisite shear of chelev, of basar, of sacrificial matter? And the answer normally is no, with one exception, ola. By ola, they can combine. Why can they? As we've seen over, why can they combine by ola? Why can they combine by ola? Because by ola, all parts of the carbon have the same destiny, right? They have the same, what is it? Status. And sounds very ominous, right? You do the same thing with all parts of the carbon. No, that's not the technical. I'm going to work on this lesson a little bit. Right? So in other words, they all have the same avoda. Right? Everything is burnt. So because every same process, thank you, right? Because everything is burnt, ultimately again, therefore they can combine. That's what Rabbi Yeshua says. I will say incredible. Umincha, now I will say, by the way, just before we go on, that's why again, let's go full circle. How did we get into all this discussion over here? You're like, I have absolutely no idea, right? I'm happy I know which Masechta we're in. Right? So we'll say, so remember again, just to close the circle, the way we got to this is, remember, the last line in the Mishnah on the beginning of today's daf. What was the last line of the Mishnah? Remember, in order to be chayiv for offering up a carbon outside of the Beis HaMikdash, how much carbonic material do you need? A kizayis. What did the Mishnah say? If by an ola, a half a kizayis of meat and a half a kizayis of a more called sacrificial parts will combine. And this is now, we'll say, so it's the same theme. We see this theme. So by ola, because the entirety of the carbon is treated with the same process, i.e. it's all burnt on the mizbeach, Therefore, the different parts can combine to form the shear of kizayis. So therefore, if you burn a half a kizayis of sacrificial meat and a half a kizayis sacrificial parts of all that's out of the base of mikdash, you are chayiv for shchutei chutz. You're chayiv for offering up on the outside. Same idea over here. The Gemara says that halacha l'maisa, if let's say again you offered up a carbon, and unfortunately again the carbon was inadvertently destroyed. If you have, so Rabbi Yeshua says, as long as you have either a half a kizayis of meat or a half a kizayis of chalev, you're good to go. In general, right? If you have a kizayis of meat or a kizayis of chalev, you are good to go. What about if you have a half a kizayis of meat and half a kizayis of chalev? No, they don't combine, except in one case of olah, where they do combine. So by an olah, if you accidentally destroy the carbon olah, but you have left over a half a kizayis of meat and half a kizayis of chalev, which means a half a kizayis of meat and half a kizayis of sacrificial parts, they can combine to form the requisite share of kizayis and would allow for zrika to occur. It's the same halacha. That's why it's being brought down over here. But the Brayta says, mincha afilu kula kayemes lo yizrok. But I will say by a mincha, even if all of the mincha is intact, you can't do zrika. The Gemara says, what? Mincha mayavidite. What do you mean if the whole mincha is intact, you can't do zrika? The Rebbe says one problem with that statement, which is, there's no zrika by a mincha. Right? Zrika is a blood service. It's done by animal offerings. Mincha is a meal offering. There's no zrika. So what are you talking about over here? Amar Papa, minchas nisachim habaim hazevach. We're talking about, again, Abba say, interestingly enough, the mincha that is brought with a carbon. So this is an interesting case. So Abba say, so imagine the following situation. If you have a mincha that is being brought together with a carbon, and let's say again the carbon, the animal itself, was inadvertently destroyed or discarded, but the mincha is still intact. Does the presence of the mincha allow you to continue with the zrika? And the answer to that is no. The answer to that is no. The presence of the mincha does not allow for the zrika to continue. In order for zrika to occur, there must be a kizayis of actual sacrificial matter, sacrificial meat that is still left. In general, that means from all other karbanos, it's either a kizayis of basar or a kizayis of chalev. Ola is unique in that, again, you can combine a half a kizayis of basar and a half a kizayis of chalev. Incredible. Incredible. Mishnah. All right, it gets better. Hakometz v'halavona v'aktoras aminchas kohanim. So we'll say, so now again, same theme, liability for offering up karbanos outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So now again, we're just going to go through the list of karbanos, or I call it sacrificial, consecrated items that are not animal sacrifices. So kometz, again, we'll say kometz, but already you know, right? Mincha. Kohen takes his 3 middle fingers, he goes ahead and he scoops up the flour, the oil, and what does he do? He shaves off the side, he offers that amount on the mizbeach, and in general, as long as it's not the mincha of a Kohen, the rest of the mincha is consumed by the Kohanim. So that's kometz. Vona is the frankincense. Kitores. Now Rashi points out over here which ketores are referring to over here. Rashi says, Shebechol yom pras b'shachris upras shal bein harbayim sheiktir kizayis ben chayv. So we'll say, so again, incredible. This is the everyday ketores, right? Every single day the Kohen would offer up. We'll say, you should know that the ketores, the Gemara says, was one of the most coveted avodas. Why? Because apparently the ketores was a skula for wealth. So therefore, again, actually, the Gemara says that once a Kohen had the opportunity to do ketores, ultimately, again, you didn't get to do it a second time. Once you got to do it in order that everybody gets an opportunity. We'll say, why am I sharing this with you? Because again, that's why there's also, if you want to see hatzlacha in your parnasa. So we'll say, if you want to see what's the skula for seeing hatzlacha in your parnasa, what's the skula? What's the skula? I'm sorry? Okay, it's good skula. Let's say, first of all, the first skula for parnasa is there's no skula for parnasa, right? Get up, work harder than everyone else. Right? And get a second job, and get a third job, and do whatever you have to do and grind yourself and work hard. Everybody's looking for a skula. Everybody's looking for a life hack, right? For success. There is no life hack for success. Hard-working people who have a vision for what they want to accomplish will become successful. If you're looking to take it easy and be successful, if you're looking for a skula for parnasa, not going to work. Hard work is the key. Bezeas says it. Bezeas apecha tochal lechem. You want bread, you want money, Work hard, break a sweat. That's how you're going to be successful. Now, once you're putting in your hishtadlus, are there other things that could help you be matzliach in your parnasa? Absolutely. One of the most beautiful and important things one could do is Parshas HaKetoras. It is very important every day to recite Parshas HaKetoras. It is a tremendous segula for parnasa, and in fact, again, we're going to get it here one day. In Eretz Yisrael, you see this a lot. Dafka also to be able to say it from a klaf, to be able to say it actually from Parshat Nizal. So one of the things we have working on here in the shul is Emirat Hashem, like a framed klaf, so everyone could say Parshas HaKetoras from a klaf, a tremendous segula for parnasa. Just while we're on this topic, I will tell you in the last, I don't know if it was the last Yarchei Kala, 2 Yarchei Kalas ago, we went to the great Mekober Rabbi Gamliel Rabinovich. He also said that another tremendous segula for parnasa, don't take your tefillin off until after davening is finished. He said that is a tremendous segula for parnasa. So again, obviously, sometimes that gets in the way of b'zeas apecha toch alecha, right? Sometimes, again, a person, again, Chavra have to leave davening early. No one wants to leave davening early, right? But l'maisa, sometimes we have no choice but to leave early. Okay, that's one thing. But at least, again, on the days, perhaps where I don't have to leave early, to dafka be makbid, not to take one's tefillin off until the end of davening, I will tell you that there's Chavra who are on the Archei Kala, who are makbid about this, and they can tell you stories. They're tremendous. I don't exactly know what the correlation is, but Gamliel says it. One could take it. So again, Parshas HaKetoras, keeping your tefillin on until the end of davening, and of course, but again, but to be clear, nothing ever replaces hard work. That is the key determinant, ultimately, again, with tremendous yad d'shmaya to one's success. Anyway, the Gemara says as follows: Sakometz halavona v'aktoras uminchas kohanim. Minchas kohanim. So that's the mincha offered up by a Kohen, Minchas Kohen Mashiach, so this is the mincha of the Kohen Gadol, Minchas Nisachim, so ultimately again a mincha, right, the mincha that accompanies the carbon, all of these, Shehikriv Me'achas Men Kezais Bachotz Chayiv. So we'll say, so that's our topic. Again, remember, lest you think that halacha l'maisa, that the prohibition of offering up karbanos outside of the Beis Hamikdash only applies to animal offerings. So the Gemara says natural. The Mishnah says natural. It applies to offerings. Now again, this is not a chiddush to us. Why? We just saw this. Where do we learn this from? Whatever is supposed to be done inside, and you do it outside, you're liable for it. So again, therefore, in all these items, Rabbi Lazar poter achiyakriv iskulan. And what's interesting of Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Eliezer, interesting enough, has a different approach. Rabbi Eliezer says that halacha l'maisa, there's actually no liability for these items until you offer them in their entirety outside. Whereas the Tanakama holds that there's liability even for offering a kizayis. Rabbi Eliezer holds that halacha l'maisa, you're only chayiv if you offer up the entire amount outside. The kulan shikr bifnim, v'shir mehen kizayis, v'krivam b'chutz chayiv. And furthermore, again, I will say, any of these items that were offered up inside of the Beis Hamikdash, and you went ahead and you left over a kizayis, and you offered it up outside, ultimately, again, you are liable. You are liable for that. Incredible. The kulan, again, we'll explain how these two statements work together. The kulan shechasru kolshu vekrivam b'chutz pater, and we'll say any of these items that ultimately, again, chasru kolshu. In other words, you left something off of the carbon. We'll see exactly what this means. You offer it up outside. Pater hamakriv kodshim ve'imurim b'chutz chayiv. If you offer up kodshim and sacrificial parts outside of the Beis Hamikdash, ultimately, again, you are liable. Incredible. So we'll say, so let's analyze. So first of all, there's a lot to unpack over here. Which we'll see in the Gemara. So I went through the Mishnah a little bit quickly, but we'll see it all in the Gemara. Tana Hamaktir kizayis. And I will say the Shita Mekubetzes changes this. The Gersa over here is Hamaktir kizayis kitoras bachutz. Changes it ultimately again. If a person offers up a kizayis of kitoras bachutz outside of the Beis Hamikdash, chayiv. Chatzi pras bifnim pater. If you only offered up, I will say, just note the change in Lashon over here. If you offer up a kizayis of kitores outside of the Beis Hamikdash, you are going to be liable for that. Ultimately, again, if you went ahead and you offered up chatzi pras bifnim, if you offered up, pras means a portion. So if you only offered up a measure of kitores inside of the Beis Hamikdash, you are pater. You are pater. Okay, so we'll say, let's see exactly what this is. The Gemara says, my potter. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? You offered up half a measure of ketoris inside of the Beis Hamikdash, your potter. My potter, the Gemara says, potter zar. So the Pashtus, I assume what it means is like this, that if a non-Kohen, right, did the ketoris avoda, which obviously is a big no-no, right? A non-Kohen, a zar, is not allowed to do any avoda, but if a non-Kohen did the ketoris, but he only offered up half of the measure of ketoras, so he didn't do the proper half of ketoras, then he's going to be potter. Maybe that's what it means. Mara says, but why? Amai haktarehi. Why should he be potter for that? At the end of the day, that's still a haktara. He's still burning incense, which he's not allowed to do. So the fact that he didn't burn the complete shear, at the end of the day, why should there be a lack of liability for that? Amar Rabbi Zera Mechista, Amar Rabbi Yomi Bar Abba, Amar Rav, my potter. What does it mean, potter? Potter Tzibor. No, what it means is like this. So both say Pater Tzibor. If you look at Rashi, my Pater Tzibor, say it's in the intermediate wide lines of Rashi. Fourth line. In my Pater Tzibor, the Yotzi de Chavasan Tikizayis Havi Haktara. So both is very interesting. Watch this. We're going to see the minimum amount of ketoras that has to be offered is a kizayis, right? And that's why, by the way, all these concepts are interlinked. That's why. How much ketoras do you have to burn outside of the Beis Hamikdash in order to be liable? A kizayis. Therefore, the Gemara is saying is like this. If you burnt less than the required shear, let's say the Kohen burnt less than the required shear, than the stipulated shear for ketoras, but he burnt at least a kizayis of ketoras in the Beis Hamikdash, you're yotzei. In other words, you don't have to do any more. So if a Kohen doing the avodah of the ketoras in the Beis Hamikdash burnt less than the requisite shear, but did at least the kizayis, fulfill the obligation, and there's no need to burn any more ketoras. Amar Rabbi Zera, ikashali hakashali. So Rabbi Zera says, if something bothers you, I'm telling you what bothers me. Hadam Rav Allah habaha afilu Rabbi Eliezer moda. That I will say, interestingly enough, Rav said about this, even Rabbi Eliezer agrees with this. And I remember again, Rabbi Eliezer was the one in the Mishnah who said that when it comes to non-animal sacrifices, the only time that there's liability is if you burn the full measure outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Rabbi Eliezer would therefore seem to say that a kizayis of ketores is not enough even inside the Beis Hamikdash to satisfy the requirement. Daha Rabbi Eliezer lav haktarihi ka'amar. And I was saying, ultimately, again, I don't understand. Rabbi Eliezer was the one who said that if you don't burn the full measure of ketoras outside of the Beis Hamikdash, you're not liable for that. Which seems to be that, according to Rabbi Eliezer, the only time that there is liability for burning ketoras is when you burn the full measure. If that's the case, how could it be that, according to Rabbi Eliezer, the Kohen would discharge his obligation if he just burns a kizayis without burning the full measure? When it comes ultimately again to burning ketoras inside of the Beis Hamikdash, everyone agrees. Now, what does everyone agree with? Take a look at Rashi. Amra baktar dehechal in the widest lines, second wide line. Shebechol yom shelo ne'amar bo shir v'hai pras shir d'Rabbananu mod Rabbi Eliezer de bekizayis havi aktar l'chayev ala b'soch b'chutz olahotzi tzibar dechavasam b'fnim. So now watch this. When we talk about the daily incense offering, now interestingly enough, with the daily incense offering, Rashi points out over here that halacha l'maisa, there is no shir. The Torah doesn't give an amount. Chazal came along and gave an amount. In that daily ketoras offering, everyone agrees that as long as the Kohen did a kezayis of ketoras in the Beis Hamikdash, you're good to go, even though rabbinically you're supposed to do more. Similarly, if you burnt at least a kizayis of ketoras outside of the Beis Hamikdash on a daily on a regular day, even Rabbi Eliezer would agree that you would be liable. So where's the machlokes? Ki pligi baktar dipnim. We'll say, where's the machlokes? Listen to this. On the ketoras of Yom Kippur. Wow, the ketoras of Yom Kippur. Now, both say, now that's different. Look at Rashi. Keep pligi. B'maslisim baktar Yom Kippurim. V'lefnai v'lefnim shene'amar bo shir. Now, both say, now watch this. When it comes to the ketoras of Yom Kippur, the Torah does state a requisite amount. The Torah does say ultimately what? Malo chafnav. Malo chafnav means a handful. A handful. Demar savar malo chafnav dafka. So one opinion says malo chav, 2 handfuls. That's dafka. That is a shear. Umar savar malo chafnav lav dafka. The other opinion says ultimately again halacha l'maisa, no malo chafnav, doesn't have to be absolutely explicit. Rather, again, even that itself is not an explicit shir. We'll stop over here for today. I know we're stopping a little bit mid-topic, but interestingly enough, I will say again, so remember, we're focusing over here specifically about halacha l'maisa. What is the liability of ketores when it comes to offering up a kezayis, less than the requisite amount? Now, what we have established, interestingly enough, is a fascinating distinction between what we'll call year-long ketores versus Yom Kippur ketores. Year-long ketores, there is no mandated shir. There's a rabbinically mandated shir. Therefore, by year-long ketores, as long as you offered up a kezayis, inside you're good to go, outside you're liable. Yom Kippur, it says melo chafnav, handfuls, 2 handfuls. The machlokes is ultimately, again, is that an explicit shir or not? That's a machlokes. Further clarification, application to our Mishnah minutes to be continued tomorrow. We'll say, shkoyach. All right, have a great day, everyone.